This is a new cutting board that I just made for my parents. It's made of walnut and alder, and this is how I built it. I start by getting rough cuts of the wood that I'll need. This is 8-quarter alder and walnut, so I'm going to start by taking roughly 17-inch pieces of each to get going and start milling. I start by getting one edge straight on both the alder and the walnut. That way I can then take it over to my table saw and start sizing the pieces down. I'm not going for a uniform width, so I want the interior pieces of the cutting board to be smaller or thinner than the exterior pieces. So I start cutting some larger pieces, and then as I get further and further along, I start cutting smaller and smaller pieces. Once I have all of these done, then I can start piecing the actual board together to get an idea of what it'll look like. My original plan was to use an alternating pattern, so walnut and then alder back and forth across the board. Once I have that in place, I then take all the pieces over and start planing them down to exact sizes before I glue them. It's not fully represented in the video here, but this step actually took quite a while. It sped up. So I tried to assemble it, and then once I got it all together, I realized that I didn't really like the alternating pattern, and instead I wanted to cap it on both sides with walnut. So I grabbed the piece of 8-quarter walnut and I headed back to the chop saw to cut myself off another 17-inch piece. This is the piece that I'm going to use to cap the other end of the cutting board that currently has alder on it. Once I get it cut down to size, I then take it over to the joiner to get some nice and straight edges. And then once again, I head back over to the planer, and since I have straight edges, I can use this to get it cut down to the exact sizes that I need it so that it matches all the other pieces that I already have. Now with everything cut down to the exact right size, I'm able to take the overall design and move away from the alternating pattern and go to this symmetrical pattern with walnut capping both ends of the board. I am much happier with the way that this looks, and I'm now ready to take it and start gluing. My opinion, gluing is by far the most important step in the whole process and also the least forgiving. So I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that I get this step right. Everything before and after you can pretty much sand your way out of, but this step, if you screw it up, you're going to pay for it. So I spend most of this step trying to make sure things are as straight as possible. Anytime I have two pieces touching each other or joining here with glue, I try to make sure that they each get their own individual clamp. I use Titebond 3 for the glue because it is food safe and also has a little bit longer drying time, so it gives me a little bit more time to make sure that I've got everything just right. By the time all is said and done here, things do look a little bit crazy, but I've got them as straight as I can possibly get them, which makes everything after this so much easier. Next, I use some 80 grit sandpaper to work off the excess glue and also just to round out any imperfections between the different pieces. Despite all the extra clamps that I put on there, sometimes you still have just a little bit of give between two different pieces, and so this just gets everything nice and flat before I move on. Next, I mark the edges so that I can round them out, and then I take them over to my bandsaw and just trim off the excess pieces around the edges that I marked. Then I move over to the sander to take things down as close as I possibly can to the line that I marked. This is especially important since next I'm going to be using a router and I want to make sure that I've taken off as much material as I possibly can. I then use my rounded corner jig to round out all 4 corners. I do this by attaching the jig to the cutting board and then using a flush trim router to get at least the first part of the cut that I want for each corner. I do this for all 4 corners. The only problem I'm left with after doing this is that my flush router bit only cuts down to about 2/3 of the corner of the cutting board, so I'm going to have to do something to get the rest of that material off. So then I switch over to my routing table with yet another flush trim bit. This allows me to get that last third of the material off of each corner. I repeat this for all 4 corners, and then I've got all 4 corners looking exactly the way I want, and I can move on. I then swap out the bit on my router table to a 1/4-inch rounded edge bit, and then I use that to round out the edges on the top and the bottom of the cutting board. This is probably one of the most satisfying steps in the overall process because at the end of this, it really starts to feel something like a finished piece. The edges are all soft, they've got that nice rounded corner, and it starts to feel like what I'm actually going to deliver to my parents. This step is also actually pretty easy. It's one of the fastest steps. As long as you set the routing table up right, you're basically just running this past, and there's not a whole lot to it. You just need to make sure that you get the corners right and that they have the same rounded feature. So it's time to move on to sanding. This is probably one of the most important, if not the most important part of the process, but it is also the most monotonous and boring part of the process. I'm definitely not going to show you all of the sanding that I did here, but what I ended up doing in terms of sanding took several hours. I start with an 80 grit sandpaper, and then I slowly work my way up to 400 grit. So it goes 80, 120, 220, 320, and then 400 grit. It's really fun once you actually get up to the 320 to 400 grit because the wood starts to feel really smooth, but it is just monotonous and mind-numbing sanding in 80 grit. It doesn't feel great once it's done. It's critically important. You have to do it, but it just takes forever. For each grit, I go with a revolving pattern. I start with a vertical pattern and then go to a horizontal pattern. I may do that one or more times for each grit. I do it at least once horizontal and once vertical for each grit. Then depending on what I see, I may or may not do it again. As I said, I'm not going to show you all of that here, but I'm just showing you a couple quick passes to let you know that I did spend a lot of time making sure that this thing was silky smooth by the time I was done. So the final step in the process is to coat this with oil. I used 100% pure tongue oil. I know a lot of people don't like to use 100% pure tongue oil because it takes so long to dry, but it gives you a finish that I think just can't be matched, and it's also safe for food contact. When you use 100% pure tongue oil, it can take up to 48 hours for each coat to dry. So it is a pretty involved process. And if you're looking to just get this done fast, it's definitely not the option to use. But if you have the time, which I do, it really just doesn't compare in terms of the overall finish that you get. I love tongue oil. It's easy to work with. And again, the end result is just kind of unmatched. So it's by far my favorite finish to use for making a cutting board. But it does take time. So what you see me doing here is just making sure that I get it everywhere. So the first coat that you put on, you need to put it on really thick. You want it to kind of just drench it and just give it a chance. Like make sure that there's enough that it just gets absolutely everywhere on the cutting board so that any little crack, any fissure, everything just gets filled in and then the cutting board ends up just being completely soaked. After you put this first coat on though, you need to wait about 40 minutes just to really let it soak in. And then once that's done, you can come back and then you wipe it off. All right, but you need to so give it about 40 minutes to soak in, come back, wipe it off with a shop towel, and then let that sit for 1 to 2 days. I recommend putting on at least 2 to 3 coats, if not more. Mileage may vary kind of depending on your area, what the humidity is, how dry it is, but you want to put at least 2 to 3 coats on, and again, if not more. I know some people that put on at least 6 coats. For this cutting board, I'm only going to put on 2 or 3. That's been kind of the happy medium for the area that I live here in Spokane. But again, some people may need to do more or less. It really just depends on your environment. And once you're done with that, you're pretty much done with the board. Once the oil is properly dried, it's ready for use. So this is the end result. I'm really happy with how it turned out, and I had a ton of fun making it. If you're still watching this, I hope you really enjoyed seeing the process. Thank you.